This is Into the SingleVerse with Raj Verma. Unfiltered conversations about the latest trends and the tangible effects of real-time data on pivotal industries, our daily lives, and the future of our world.
My guest this week is Nick Thompson, CEO of The Atlantic, one of the most iconic magazines in America. Nick has an illustrious career as a journalist. Prior to leading The Atlantic, Nick was editor-in-chief for Wired and at a major news outlet, including CNN, Bloomberg, and The New Yorker. He's written and edited many famous articles, including a piece in Wired magazine that was turned into the movie Argo, starring Ben Affleck. Nick is also a really fast marathon runner, a musician, and a tech entrepreneur. Awesome to have you on the show. You're one of the rare sort of individuals which has married technology and media. So what came first, technology or media? Or?
Probably technology came first. I went to college at Stanford right during the internet boom. And so, while my degrees were, Earth Systems and Poli-Sci, I was still a little bit caught up in that and, very much involved in some tech projects there. And then after college, I went and worked for a Linux hardware company called Penguin Computing. Mm-hmm. And I worked there, and it was from there that I moved to my first journalism job, which was at the Washington Monthly. So my career, if you look at my 20s, it's predominantly journalism, very little tech, but I think tech came first.
Oh, that's fascinating. And, for all the guests that we've had, you're unique in multiple ways, but this is one question that I can't ask any of my other guests. How does it feel to be abducted?
Well, it was terrifying. I mean, that was a little bit of how I got into journalism. When I was 22, I went to travel in Africa and had some ups and downs in my very short career up to that point, and went to travel in Africa with a friend and was abducted only for about 24 hours in Morocco. And this is prior to 2001, so it's a little more innocent time. It didn't feel like, we were part of a major war. But I was abducted by drug dealers who had kind of a half-baked plan it wasn't quite clear even in retrospect what they wanted. But they locked me in a bathroom and then they debated what to do to me in Arabic. And then they kind of went through my stuff and threw me out. And that was that.
And on a scale of 1 to 10 on just how scared you were, was it terrifying?
No, I would say it was 8.5.
Oh, wow.
It wasn't 9.9.
Was it 9.9? Yeah, I would imagine it probably would have been sort of 9.9, but
I think if it had been after 9/11, it would have been 9.9. Right, getting kidnapped in Morocco after 9/11, when the U.S. was at war in Afghanistan, after Daniel Pearl, that would have been much more terrifying. But this was, this is 1997, so it's a different era.
Yeah, the different era. No, I quite understand. And you said that was one of the experiences that led you to journalism. Could you elaborate on
indirectly? So what happened was I wasn't quite sure what to do professionally back then, and I was just sort of flailing around a little bit, trying a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and that would continue for a few years. But I wrote about my experiences traveling in Africa in the Washington Post. And I think part of the reason they accepted the story is because I wrote to them and said, hey, I'd like to write about, the last few months, what's happened to me traveling in Africa. It starts with me getting kidnapped. And that's a much more appealing story than it starts with me being surprised at the languages, right? And so, the Post accepted the story because this dramatic thing had happened. And then as, went through those complicated first couple of years, I had run a story in the Washington Post. And so when I applied to the job at the Washington Monthly that ended up being the job I got and the job that started my career, I sent them the clip from the Washington Post and presto.
Yeah, that's so awesome. And were you fond of writing? Was that an expression of your emotions, cathartic, all that growing up? School kid, high school, during those times?
Not growing up. I didn't think of myself as a good writer growing up. I didn't think of myself, I was a math team kid. I didn't think of myself as either a talented writer or one who was passionate about it. Um, that started to change in college. And I think the reason for it was I was a political activist, and I don't know how it developed, but I started to develop a voice and started to write op-eds for the school paper, and then wrote some op-eds for national papers. And then I founded a newspaper on thought and debate on campus where, a conservative friend of mine would get his friends to write and I would get my liberal friends to write, and we would debate the big issues on campus or the big issues in the world. I started to see the power of journalism, and I started to get a sense of my own voice and style. But I don't think I had any confidence as a writer when I was a kid or in high school.
Fascinating. And someone with such diverse interest, running the marathon in 2 hours, 29 minutes, Chicago at that, and acoustic guitar albums, and, entrepreneur and a journalist of the highest merit. What what does a human having diverse interest, how come you have those? What do they do for you? How are you just have this unsatiable appetite for just looking at the next greatest thing to kind of wrap your hands around?
It's either a flaw or a strength in my personality. I've always been curious about lots of things. I've always tried lots of things. I've definitely had people throughout my life who say, "Well, settle down and focus more," or you put more time into just one thing. But I've always liked doing lots of different things, and I always had lots of academic interests. I always had lots of hobbies. As I've gotten older, I do think that I have two real hobbies. My primary commitment is like being a good dad to my three kids, and then I have this job at the Atlantic, and there are lots of elements to my job. But the two hobbies are running and playing guitar, and I do think that they both serve a function in life where they, provide mental outlets. Running serves a form of meditation for me. There are lots of things I've learned in running that are helpful in my professional life. I do actually think that the act of intense athletic training helps the kind of concentration you need in your job, and actually staying concentrated in your job also helps athletic performance. They also detract from each other in certain ways, but they're generally additive. So it's always just been who I am, and I hope I found a balance where my hobbies are relatively helpful to the stuff that matters the most.
And do you also have 24 hours in the day like the rest of us?
Yeah, I have 24 hours. I sleep a lot. I spend tons and tons of time with my kids. I find efficiencies. Like I now my running training is sometimes with my kids. I play guitar. Like some days, the only time I play guitar, in fact, most days, is playing my kids to sleep. So, you mix things up a little bit.
Now, talking about journalism and AI, the other stuff that I'm fascinated by is speakeasy AI. And we should, of course, talk about it in person as well someday. But if I was to, when I talk to a few other writers, especially in Hollywood, etc., with all the strikes and all that going on, it seems like AI and journalism have been at odds for some time now. I understand that, you can't truly celebrate something that you can't quite understand. And I like what you say, don't be afraid of AI, embrace it. Or I'm paraphrasing, of course. You seem to be someone who's embraced AI, and in doing so made journalism better, if the performance of Atlantic was anything to go by. What are your views of the coexistence of AI and journalism, and how do one make the other better?
That's a big question and a hard question. You're absolutely right in the premise that my industry in general has been skeptical of AI. And it's skeptical of AI because, the media industry in general has had a rough relationship with platforms over the last 10 years. And if this is the new platform, maybe the relationship will be rough. There's lots of concerns that AI could be used to replace us. And then there's the very specific concern that many of these large language models were trained without giving compensation on data created by journalists. And so there's a lot of antipathy. My view is that none of those arguments is wrong. And in fact, I'm deep in negotiations on the licensing question, the last question I raised. But my general view is, look, I don't know what AI is going to do to journalism. I don't know what it's going to do to media. I'm pretty confident it's going to do a bunch of bad things. But I'm also pretty confident it's going to do a bunch of amazing things. And my role over the next few years, or one of the roles I'll play, is trying to help figure out how to get the most good from it and the least bad, both for the Atlantic specifically and for the media industry in general. And so to do that, you can't run away from it. You have to run towards it. You have to learn how the tools work. You have to experiment with them. You have to see how they can make you be better at your job within all the appropriate ethical guidelines. You have to, understand, okay, exactly what are these models doing? Exactly what is the next generation? Okay, so now exactly how does RAG work? Okay, what are the differences between these models? Why do they work certain ways? Like understanding all of these different questions is extremely important for journalism. And so my job is to figure out, how is the news ecosystem going to get changed, and how can the Atlantic compete and have a sustainable business model, right? Search is going to change. All kinds of things are going to change. How do we figure out the best, most ethical way to deal with the platforms as partners, licensing data, et cetera? And then what are the tools that are created by AI that will make us do our jobs better, more efficiently, more honestly, more fairly, win more trust as opposed to losing it? It's a pretty interesting and exciting problem to deal with.
Yeah. And you think it plays out over the next 6 months, 18 months, 3 years? Where do you think we get some sort of resolution that after that it's diminishing returns for both parties of sorts?
I think that we figure out, in the next 6 months, we figure out some things, right? We'll figure out the licensing issue, for example, right? The New York Times has sued OpenAI. Maybe that won't get settled in the next 6 months. Maybe it'll get settled in the next 12 months. But there will be that, the question of fair compensation for the media industry, that will be resolved. And there's a lot of unknowns there. I think we'll also start to get the first truly useful tools in our industry. I mean, large language models have been around for a year and a half out from ChatGPT, and there's very little, right? There aren't that many use cases that are really good, right? We use it to create audio on our stories. We're working on translation. I know the other publications use translation. Like New York Magazine has a cool bot for like helping you buy things, right? There's cool test use cases, but I think in the next year we'll have some great use cases. In the next 3 years, we'll probably get a better sense of what happens to search and what happens to the internet, right? Whether there is a situation where search kind of goes away as we know it, right? There is no Google with 10 blue links, which is how most people find news organizations. There's a possibility that actually we end up getting as much search referral traffic, but it just comes from new search engines, whether it's one run by Google, whether it's through Perplexity, whether it's through OpenAI. There's reporting recently in MIT Tech Review about plans to that end. So maybe in the next 2 to 3 years we'll get that, and then the next stage, I think you asked 1 year, 3 year, 5 years. Then maybe after that we start to get clarity on what is the competitive landscape? Like what is it? Right now we compete with a relatively small subset of publications for attention, for writers. You will probably compete with the same publications for writers, but where will we compete for attention? Will there be new media ecosystems that are entirely algorithmically generated, which therefore have a very low cost basis against which we'll have to compete? That would be complicated. So we'll have a much better sense then about what exactly we're doing and how exactly we're going to compete.
Didn't you just write a book using AI, a children's book? Is that true?
I did.
Yeah.
Not a real children's book. So my children, I tell stories every night, and one of them, I was for a long time telling a story about what's called the Animal World Cup, where different species compete against each other, right? So the centipedes will play the owls, right? And the centipedes are really good at dribbling with all their legs, and the owls want to play at night. And I then worked, that was it was for his 9th birthday. And so then I worked with his older brother, who's then 12, and we wrote a book with AI helping us about the Animal World Cup. And then we used DALL-E to make art, and then we printed it. So it was a book for 9-year-old James, written by Nick and 12-year-old Zachary. But it wasn't, you can't buy it on Amazon. But it's awesome. It's truly awesome. He has it on his shelf. It's one of the coolest things we've done together.
Oh, that's fascinating. And was the output, what you're saying, pretty damn good?
Oh, it's great. The story is mine, right? I came up with the themes over the course of years telling the stories. But the art was amazing. We had the AI write national anthems. I do want to do another book. I have the story I've been telling the last year it's kind of this Wizard Quest story about a boy who was, born out of a bog, and raised by chickadees. And he's been, turns out he's been fighting a dark lord who turns out to be a chickadee. And we've just reached one climax, and now he's traveling through the Joshua Tree Desert with a bear and a spider. And as soon as I retire from the Atlantic, I'm going to turn it into a children's book series, and AI will be very helpful. I mean, it's great. If I'm stuck and I tell the story every night at 9:30, and if it's 9:27 and I haven't thought of tonight's episode, I will sometimes go into Claude 3 or GPT-4 and say, these are the characters. We're in the Joshua Tree Desert. Help me think of the next step about what happens with the cactuses.
Oh wow, this is. But I can almost bet you my bottom dollar that AI is not going to be able to write the next Argo, fascinating movie.
Yeah.
I've been waiting to ask you this question. How did you happen upon that story? And
About Argo?
Yeah, Argo. And what did you feel of the end result? I thought it was awesome, but for you who had the blueprint for it, what was your sort of...
That's funny.
Yeah.
I do have a good story about this. So I was an editor at Wired, and this is somewhere, I don't know, let's say it's 2007, 2008. And I was working with a writer named Josh Behrman, who I adore. And he's got a great sense. And what he would do is he would go around and he would just talk to people. And he was, spent a lot of time in Los Angeles. And he'd say, hey, do you have a great story? What is an unknown thing? And he came to me and he's like, I've got a couple ideas. And I remember there were two. There may have been more, but I remember the memo as having two. And it was something like, I've got two stories I've stumbled upon. One is this crazy escape mystery from 1979, Iran and the CIA, and the second is there's this guy who tells me that Stalin created a half-man, half-ape army. And I was like, okay, I don't think the second one's true, Josh. So why don't we pursue the first one? And so Josh, runs it down. We pitch it to Wired. It was a very funny thing. Wired at that time was run by this brilliant guy named Chris Anderson, who I love. And he had this system where there were maybe 10 editors, and we would present our stories, and then everybody on staff, so all 50 people, would rank them. Right? They'd rank them 1 to 6. And so you had a little bit of democracy. It was Chris's way of bringing math to this decision. We had a democracy underneath an autocracy because he would eventually make the decision. And I remember the pitch meeting where I had presented, I think we called it CIA Sci-Fi, and I had the lowest score of all the pitches, right? Because the staff was like, what does this have to do with Wired? This is about 1979. We're a magazine about the future. And I was like, I don't know, they dressed up as a science fiction film. That's Wired. It's Escape. That's Wired. It's Disguise. It's Wired. And Chris was like, everybody else was like, this idea is terrible. And Chris was like, no, it's great. We're doing it. And so despite the democracy being very much against this idea, and got assigned, and then Josh did a great job, wrote a wonderful story. We knew he wanted to sell it to Hollywood, and so the art was storyboarding, right? Make it as easy as possible for Hollywood to see what it was. And then remarkably, it sold. And then even more remarkably, it got made, right? In journalism, you have all these stories that get optioned, and they always get attached to people with big names, and you get really excited, and then nothing happens. But somehow this story got made, and then amazingly, it got made and it was good. And then amazingly, it won an Academy Award. So I was, of course, thrilled, right? It was Josh's story. Josh did the hard work. Josh was involved with the movie. I just watched it. But I love that.
Yeah, that was fascinating.
And, if indeed it turns out that the half-man, half-ape army is true, someone listening has a tip, send me an email. I'm very easy to find.
No, absolutely. You should do that. You're also a tech entrepreneur. It's so. What, as a tech entrepreneur, what are your hopes, expectations from AI, and what is it that you're probably apprehensive about from in this entire AI world?
Well, I'm apprehensive about so much. I mean, I've been an entrepreneur twice. I started a company called The Atavist, which was, multimedia CMS. It actually started as a magazine, right? And the way these things evolve, where we were like, let's make a magazine that's optimized for telling stories in multiple formats. As we started to make the magazine, we realized the tools to create it didn't exist. We built the tools, and we realized the tools were a lot more valuable than the stories. We licensed the tools, and eventually we sold the company to WordPress. Right? And it was a couple years, ups and downs. The final valuation was, entrepreneurs listening to this, a subset of them will understand, but the final sale price was somewhat lower than the highest valuation we had at the apex of our journey. But regardless, happy outcome, technology lives on. And in fact, the magazine, 15 years on, is still printing. It's incredible. So that was entrepreneur journey number one. And then the second was this company called Speakeasy, which you mentioned briefly before, which I started 2 years ago. And the idea, we started like a little bit before ChatGPT, interestingly. And the goal was to try to build a platform on the internet where conversations would lead to, enlightenment, not hostility, right? Where people would feel like they'd learned something and not as though they'd been stuck in a filter bubble and so we tried very hard with the nudges we had on the platform to nudge people to productive conversations. We built, the ranking algorithm was all based on how people had reacted in sort of sophisticated ways. It was to create a conversational platform where the posts and the conversations are ranked based on the value they add to your thinking, not just to the emotional resonance. And I started with my friend Rafi Krikorian, who had been the head of engineering at Twitter. And he's the CTO of Emerson, which is the parent company of The Atlantic. So it was always like a project inside both of our jobs. And it was awesome. And we launched like a closed beta, and we had incredible conversations, maybe 500 beta conversations. And then we tried to productize it, and that was a lot harder. And finding business models was a lot harder. And so we ended up selling the technology to Amplica Labs, and that closed a couple weeks ago. And so we, as you may have noticed, Speakeasy did not displace Facebook, Twitter, and TikTok. But we did, for a moment, we did build something very cool. What am I worried about? I mean, I'm worried about all the bad use cases of AI that you're familiar with and everybody talks about. The interesting thing that we noticed, as an entrepreneur, and the thing I worry about is, given the power of the large language models, like, how do you build a moat, right? We had an interesting moment in our building where we had, fine-tuned GPT 3.5 Turbo. We put a lot of work into it. We custom-tuned it on our own data, and then this GPT-4. And GPT-4 outperforms our, like, amazingly fine-tuned model, right? And one of our smart friends had predicted this. He's like, look, you guys are taking a small engine and, changing the, angle of the windshield, and your car is going to get beaten by, the big clunker with the big engine. And it was true, right? And so what we learned there is, like, actually it's very hard to build a moat as these large language models keep improving and as they are so good, right? So how do you build a product with a moat? And I think that's true of a lot of AI companies out there. They have essentially no moat. And they say we're doing AI and we've built this amazing thing, but, GPT-5 comes out and you'll be able to do everything they've done. So that was the one interesting lesson I had on sort of the entrepreneur side. Or not the one. That was one of 700, but that's the one that just came to mind.
Thanks, Nick, for the engaging insights today. We've covered a lot, but there's still much to unpack about the future of journalism and AI. Join us in part 2, where we dive deeper into the ethical challenges and innovations shaping the media landscape. Don't miss it as we continue exploring these crucial topics. See you in the next episode.
This was Into the SingleVerse with Raj Verma. To learn more about Raj, please go to rajverma.com. This is a Single Store podcast production.